Hello, today I thought I'd talk about 10 books that I think are essential to students of World War II. Now, there are thousands of books out there on World War II. I haven't read them all, but these are 10 books that I would feel comfortable putting in a graduate readings class. There's probably 3 or 4 on this list that I would definitely put in a graduate readings class. I'm not going to rank these books, but I'm just going to talk about each one of these briefly and let you know why I think you should read them. First book I want to talk about is Gordon Prang's At Dawn We Slept, The True Story of Pearl Harbor. This book, by Prang and a few other authors as well, but this book is kind of the definitive book on World War II. It remains the definitive book on World War II. And it is kind of a meticulous look at kind of the Japanese thought process, the American response, kind of diplomatically what was going on before the attack, and then ultimately what happens during the attack itself. The book actually, kind of the third section of the book actually goes over the events of the court-martial of Husband Kimmel and kind of the various investigations into what went wrong. It's a solid book that tells an important story about the Second World War. Highly recommended. The next book I want to talk about is The Day of Battle, the War in Sicily and Italy, 1943 to 1944. This is Rick Atkinson's second book in his Liberation trilogy. Now, all of these books are worth reading, but I particularly enjoyed this one because Italy, I think, oftentimes gets the historical understandings of the war in Italy often kind of fall by the wayside when we're talking about the war in northwestern Europe or the war on the Eastern Front, and Italy is often neglected. And this is just a fantastic book that kind of details that slow slog up the Italian peninsula. It starts, of course, with Patton's, the 7th Army's invasion of Sicily, and then it goes into Mark Clark, his 5th Army, of course the British 8th Army, as they work their way up the Italian peninsula. It doesn't shy away from a lot of the more controversial things that happened there, like the Rapido River crossing or the Anzio landing or Clark's decision to take Rome, kind of against Harold Alexander's orders. But it's a fascinating book, incredibly well documented. It was very helpful to me in my dissertation, which I wrote partially on the war in Italy. So this was just a fantastic book, highly recommended. The next book I want to talk about is War Without Mercy. War Without Mercy, Race and Power in the Pacific War by John Dower. This book is chilling because it really presents, when we think of the Second World War, when we think of the various ideologies involved, and we think of racism, we tend to think of the Germans and their ideas of Untermenschen and the Jews and what have you. And what's very interesting about this book is Dower presents, first of all, the Japanese as having kind of an equal worldview of their racial superiority to other Asian peoples and to Westerners. But what is really quite chilling about this book is the fact that he so successfully says, but Americans had this incredibly racial and racist view toward the Japanese as well. And you kind of, I think on some level maybe already understand that, but he really gets into the details about it. They talk about how you've got servicemen kind of returning from the Pacific, bringing Japanese skulls to use as paperweights back home. I mean, really dark things like this. But they talk about various atrocities of the Japanese and Americans, killing prisoners and what have you. And it's a very, very disturbing look kind of into that aspect of the war. But also it's an important aspect. And again, he has several kind of those anecdotes and those little ideas there. For instance, you're talking about how the Americans believe that the Japanese must have had German sighters for their artillery on Okinawa, or German pilots flying at Pearl Harbor because the Japanese just couldn't see that well to aim. And I mean, just a lot of other really racially charged ideas like that. Very good book, really holds up. And for any student in the Pacific War, you definitely want to read John Dower's War Without Mercy. Next book on my list is The Nemesis of Power, The German Army and Politics, 1918 to 1945. This was written by Sir John Wheeler-Bennett. Sir John Wheeler-Bennett was, I believe he was a British diplomat living in Germany, and so he saw firsthand all of these events occur. In fact, Wheeler-Bennett was actually a target, supposedly, of the SS during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934 when Hitler was cleaning house. Supposedly they actually went after him, but he wasn't where they thought he was going to be, so he escaped. But nevertheless, he writes this book about, really it's about the German resistance to the the German army resistance to the Nazi regime. Now, it doesn't cut corners. It doesn't exonerate anybody who was complicit in any of the crimes or what have you. But it does kind of show that you did have this solid military clique that certainly was willing to support Hitler when he was winning the war. But when the war started to turn against him, they ultimately turn against him as well. And the book really kind of culminates with the 1944 bomb plot against Hitler. This is a fascinating look into the inner workings of the Nazi regime and its relationship with the military. It really is the nexus of power. I read this several years ago while I was in Berlin. It was kind of interesting reading to read while you're there in the heart of the beast, so to speak. And it was a very, very good book. Again, highly recommended. My next book is Rampage, MacArthur, Yamashita, and the Battle for Manila. This is by James Scott. This book, so I have read, dozens, if not over 100 books on subjects about the atrocities of World War II, German and Japanese atrocities that were committed during the war. And I have to tell you, this is probably the hardest book I've ever had to read from that standpoint. Scott does not shy away from detailing the various problems, the various bloody episodes that the Japanese carried out while they were retreating in the Philippines. Now, Scott does a good job, of course, of detailing kind of MacArthur and what the army was going through when they landed on the Philippines. But really, the heart of this book is showing just how inhumane that the Japanese army was to not only the Filipino people who suffered atrociously under this this episode, but also against Westerners. Many Americans and other Westerners had been held captive by the Japanese since they took over the Philippines 4 years earlier. And it's a chilling book to read, but it's also highly informative and highly instructive about just what happened and just the true depths of horror that occurred in the Philippines at this time. Highly, highly recommended. The next book I want to talk about is Stalingrad from Anthony Beevor. Stalingrad is, of course, it's one of those names, it's one of those battles that's just kind of associated with the idea of the turning point in the war, of German defeat. I personally think the turning point came a lot earlier, but nevertheless, this is the point where the German army was not just stopped, it was stopped before Moscow, but here it is just decisively thrashed. Germany really does lose the initiative on the Eastern Front with Stalingrad, certainly. It's no longer going to be able to mount these massive, massive attacks as they had in the past on the Eastern Front. And Beevor does a wonderful job of showing how this happened, how German initiative falls apart. He also talks about really the intuitiveness and the intelligence of the Soviet commanders and the Soviet leaders who understood, we can just keep feeding things into the meat grinder, or we can build up on the flanks and prepare a really good attack, which eventually comes in November of 43, and they're able to surround the 6th Army in the city. So you really do get a sense of just how the Germans were making bad decisions and how the Soviets ultimately are able to capitalize on that by making some really smart moves. I think one of the things one of the big takeaways for me in this book is I remember the section where they're talking about the doctors and Beevor talks about the doctors, and he talks about the cold and just how the cold was affecting people, and just how after a while it was so cold and you're so cold for so long that it just kind of makes you apathetic and it numbs you to everything, and how the German soldiers were really suffering from this, and the doctors tried to combat it. Anyway, great book. That is Stalingrad from Anthony Beevor. Next up, I want to talk about a book called Engineers of Victory by Paul Kennedy. Engineers of Victory is a brilliant book about exactly how the Allies were able, from a technological standpoint, to beat the Axis. They talk about several things. They talk about, of course, the Merlin engines in the Mustangs, and they talk about the various ways that the German U-boats were defeated with the Hedgehog mortar system, and the searchlights, and the various ways they were able to extend the range of planes in order to give more air cover to convoys so they could spot the U-boats. They also talk about, he has one of the last chapters is the tyranny of distance, where they talk about how the United States was able to overcome the Pacific in that war. just how they were able to, knock out those carriers and just build those carriers, build those aircraft carriers, and how they were absolutely decisive in the struggle against Japan. Talk about the idea of amphibious landings, how you land on a shore and hold on to a shore, and kind of what the Allied experience was with that throughout the war in Italy and in Normandy and the Pacific, and how critical and important that was as well. There's just a lot of good things in this book that really will enlighten you as far as the technological progress that the Allies made. And of course, you kind of get the sense, too, of the Germans only progressed so far. They had this kind of technological edge prior to the war, and then it was kind of overtaken by the Allies during the war. Brilliant book. Absolutely recommend. That is Engineers of Victory by Paul Kennedy. Next up is a book by Phillips, Payson, O'Brien. This is How the War Was Won. Now, How the War Was Won has kind of a very controversial argument to it. Now, for decades now, the kind of the popular idea is that the World War II was won and lost by the Germans on the Eastern Front. That it was that contest, that great land battle contest between Russia and Germany, that ultimately is where the war was decided. But O'Brien actually just has some incredible statistics, some incredible facts talking about Allied production. Now, how much Allied production actually went into building tanks and artillery and these sorts of things, versus how much production actually went into the air war and into the naval construction. And what the picture he paints is that those losses on the Eastern Front, while certainly significant, were not nearly as decisive as perhaps we've been thinking they were for the last few decades. And he kind of says, the side that was able to control movement, both over the seas and in the air, that is the side that fundamentally was able to win the war. And he really paints a good picture and a good idea about how that happened. He has a few other controversial statements, but I mean, fundamentally his argument is based on production and how is production used. For instance, he talks about the Battle of Britain, and he says, as soon as Winston Churchill is making this speech, this is their finest hour, yada yada yada. The battle was already won. The battle of production was already won, and then that decided what happened, on the battlefield, so to speak. And it's kind of one of these arguments that, in a sense, is kind of difficult to take, because I think for many people, myself included, there's kind of that romantic idea of the men at the front able to change the course of a war. But by World War II, that is just perhaps not a very accurate and realistic way to look at this conflict, to look at the nature of modern conflict, where production was so absolutely critical. And you could lose a battle or win a battle, and the war may not necessarily at all hinge on that specific battle, because it's part of a larger whole that is based on production. Very good book. I'm not entirely sure I'm convinced, but I know I'm not convinced. I highly recommend reading Philip Payson O'Brien's How the War Was Won. So the penultimate book I'd like to talk about is Victor Davis Hanson's The Second World Wars, How the First Global Struggle Was Fought and Won. This came out just a few years ago. And this is a remarkable book on a lot of levels. I actually did a full video on this book a while back. But essentially, his fundamental argument is, well, there's several fundamental arguments, but one of them is that we need to start looking at World War II as primarily a war against the German and Japanese governments, against unarmed civilians. That really is a lot of what the war is. He also says, this isn't just one war. The Second World War wasn't one war. It was many wars conducted over many fronts by many different peoples for many different reasons, and he does a good job of exploring that. This is not a strict narrative of World War II. Of course, he goes into various aspects, leaders, tanks, planes, the air war, the sea war. He goes into various aspects. It's very reminiscent of his earlier War Like No Other, which was about the Peloponnesian War, which again was not a narrative. It went into various subsections of the war and aspects of the war. And he does this again here, and he does it very, very well. This is one of the best analyses of World War II that I've ever read, and I highly recommend Victor Davis Hanson's The Second World Wars. The last book I'd like to talk to you about is Richard Overy's Why the Allies Won. Why the Allies won this? Again, this is not another narrative. This is not a narrative of the war, but it is a very good analysis based on a lot of different factors. For instance, he talks, spends a lot of time talking about the U-boat war and the Battle of the Atlantic, and just how Allied. He's making the argument that here, okay, it kind of was about the ability of the Allies to hold this off before American production could really kick into high gear. And he says, I think he says Allied production doesn't really kick into high gear until late 1943, but the Battle of the Atlantic was already kind of done by that point, and it was won by that point. So he makes the point that here you actually have really skilled sailors, primarily British but also American, who were able to overcome this threat, this German U-boat menace, in a very intelligent, very efficient way, even before all that production kicks in. But then he also talks too about stuff like in the air war, and he mentions that he kind of justifies the Allied bombing campaign, and he justifies it by saying that the Germans were forced to put tremendous amounts of their anti-aircraft artillery in Germany and tremendous amounts of their fighters in Germany to protect the country from Allied bombing. And what this did is it diverted significant amounts of production from the German army on the Eastern Front. Those were fighter planes and those were anti-aircraft artillery weapons that could not be employed against the Soviets, that made the war for the Soviets easier there, and therefore it was entirely worth it. I tend to agree with this assessment. I think that's a very astute assessment. But anyway, it's a fascinating book. Again, many different aspects of the war are covered, and he does a very, very good job. So that is How the War Was Won by Richard Overy. Please, so these are just some of my suggestions for the reading. Again, some of these books I think are absolutely critical, and all of them I think should be read by serious students of World War II at one point or another. Please leave a comment. Let me know what you think. I may do another video like this with some more books on this and other subjects. But let me know what you think, and please subscribe to the channel. Thank you.